happy to see your happy faces. It's like family reunion, right? So thank you for coming back for this special type of workshop. As you see, we have invited a couple of really distinguished scholars, professors in our field. And first of all, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Peter Roger. And currently, he is Director of Pro-Representative in Applied Linguistics and TESOL at Macquarie University in Sydney. Have you been to Australia? Yes. University of Sydney. Anyway, he is such a rare and distinguished figure in our field, mainly because based on his dual degrees, both in medicine, surprising, and linguistics, drawing on those experiences, his research areas lie in the broad context of health communication. But the focus is placed on linguistic diversity. And of course he has supervised PhD students, or he has taught courses in second language acquisition. Even in that area, he has used diverse experiences in diverse contexts. So he is interested in the links between language learning, motivation, and identity. All those high issues in this rapidly globalizing world, right? But what's surprising even more is he knows a lot about us, Korean culture, Korean teaching context. How? Something private, but he has been married to a Korean woman. She is also teaching at Macquarie University at this point. So he has been invited to TESOL and many other conferences over the world in the past some years. So it is a real honor for us to invite him for us today. And he's going to have a workshop titled as Today. Motivating foreign language learners, and he's going to use a whole-person approach. He's going to combine diverse elements to motivate our language learners. So why don't you give a big round of applause to Dr. Peter Roger.
교수님 감사합니다. 시간 내주셔서 감사합니다. But I will continue in English, if that's okay. Do you want me to use the microphone, or is it okay without the microphone? It's okay without? Oh. Thank you very much, Professor Young, for your very kind introduction. It's too kind, I think. But it's a great pleasure to be here at Sookmyung today with you and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is motivating foreign language learners. As Professor Young was telling you, I work at Macquarie University, and I teach in the program called our Master of Applied Linguistics and TESOL. And the subject that I teach is second language acquisition. And one of the big topics in second language acquisition, as many of you would know, concerns looking at the individual differences in the way that people acquire languages. So things like learning strategies, learning styles, and motivation is one of those individual differences. And I don't have all the answers for motivating foreign language learners. I wish I did. But what I would like to do today is to just talk a little bit about some of the approaches to studying foreign language learning motivation that have happened over the past few decades. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how the field has evolved, and some of you may be familiar with some of these approaches already. But then what I want to do is to try and bring together research that comes from a different field, I guess. And this is the area of the bilingualism studies. Because it seems to me it's quite interesting that some of the things that people say about motivation research in foreign language and second language acquisition, and some of the things that people talk about in bilingualism research are very similar in a way, but often it's different researchers and different readers who are talking about these things. So what I'd like to try and do is bring those together and just to try to present some ideas about motivating language learners. So I understand from Dr. Young that most of you, or perhaps all of you, are teaching in the public school system. Is that right? Yeah. How many are elementary school teachers? Middle school teachers? High school teachers? Okay. Anybody else that I didn't cover? So I guess you're probably faced every day with lots of language learners, some of whom are quite motivated, some of whom are a little bit motivated when there's an exam coming up maybe, and others who are very difficult to motivate at all. Is that a good summary? That's probably the same with any language learning situation almost anywhere in the world, I would say. When we think about motivation, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that it concerns a sort of fundamental question, which is why people think and behave as they do. And so I don't think we can ever have the full answer as far as motivation is concerned, what motivates people. But what researchers have tried to do, and I think what we all try to do in teaching, is to think about the different things that motivate our students and sometimes motivate ourselves as language learners, and how we can kind of capitalize on those to develop some strategies for helping them to maximize motivation. So when we think about motivation, there are many possible influencing factors that you might be aware of. So for example, things like you see examinations there. Examinations are often a big motivator of one kind, and you see things like career as well. But you also see things like identity and self, and goals, and things like that. And when we look at these things, we can see that some of them are factors that happen at a particular point in time and then go away, whereas others are much more enduring sorts of ideas. Things like identity itself, which never goes away. And so what people have tried to do in motivation research is to make sense of these different factors in various different ways. And so that's what I'll try and illustrate today, how that's been done, and maybe just add a little bit more about some other ways of thinking about motivation that I find interesting. So as individuals, we're all motivated by different things, of course. So what gets one person motivated to do something doesn't necessarily motivate other people to do the same thing. And language learning is like that as well. And so I think that having a sort of a toolkit of different strategies that having a toolkit of different strategies to help motivate language learners is a good approach, because if we're only doing one thing, then it's going to work for some people, but probably not work for everyone. What I'm going to be talking about today, basically my underlying belief here, I guess, is that I think it's important for individuals to see using more than one language in their lives as something that is both natural and achievable. Just talking to people from different parts of the world at different times in different contexts, I realize that it's quite interesting that I think in some parts of the world people see language diversity and multilingualism, bilingualism, as being a natural state, something that most people do, and nothing particularly remarkable. In other parts of the world, it's something that people see as very kind of special in some way, or very unusual. And I think a useful step is for people to see that the use of other languages is something that's natural and achievable, and I'll explain what I mean more about that as we go through. Learning an additional language or languages, I don't think it changes who we are as individuals, but it does open up lots of new possibilities for interacting with the world and understanding the world. And I'm sure all of you are high-level language learners, probably I know at least 2 languages that you speak, but probably many of you speak many other languages as well. So sometimes people talk about being a different person in another language, and I know some learners talk about that. They feel like they're a different person. But I think for many of us, it's probably not that we're a different person, but perhaps it opens up new ways of thinking and understanding and interacting with the world. So maybe we feel a little bit like a different person, but what we're actually doing is expanding the person that we already are. And so in taking what I call a whole person approach, I'm arguing that we should focus on a person's entire linguistic repertoire rather than just considering learning another language in isolation. So if it's English that people are focused on learning, then rather than just thinking about learning English as a second language or a foreign language, to think about learning that language in the context of the language or languages that they already know, and expanding the self that they are. What I'll start off with is just talk a little bit about the history of motivation research. Some of you may be quite familiar with this, but it just helps to sort of trace where the research has come. I won't talk specifically about the research that I've been involved in today, but in the references at the end, I've mentioned a couple of studies, and I can tell you a bit about those just at the end. Also, the reference list, which you've probably got on your handout, I guess, there, I mentioned some research that's been done by a Korean researcher as well. And so if you're interested in research on motivation that's been done in the Korean context, you can have a look at those studies there. When we get to the end, I'll show you which ones those are. Anyway, the beginning of motivation research in foreign language and second language acquisition, it started in Canada. With a fellow by the name of Robert Gardner and his colleagues, specifically Gardner and Lambert, in the early 1950s. And because they were working in Canada, they looked at language learning motivation in the Canadian context. And that involved primarily English-speaking Canadians learning French, and French-speaking Canadians learning English. So in Canada, many of you may know this, we've got two main ethno-linguistic communities. I say we because I'm from Canada originally. So I was saying they, and that seemed a bit strange, so I said we. Then I thought that was strange because you think I come from Australia. But I do come from Australia, but grew up in Canada when I was much younger than I am now. So the focus of Gardner's research was on French Canadians and English Canadians learning each other's languages. And what they highlighted in their conceptualization of motivation was the importance of attitudes. So this is attitudes to the target language group. So the English-speaking Canadians, what were their attitudes towards the French Canadians? And what did they feel about? Did they want to get to know them better? Were they interested in the culture as well as the language? And the same for the French Canadians learning English. So attitudes was a very important part of the initial conceptualization of second language learning motivation. And Gardner's colleagues came up with something called the integrative motive. And I won't go into detail exactly what that comprised, but it led to the most popular part of Gardner's theory that has stayed on until this day, which is the idea of integrative motivation. And the other side of the coin from that, which is something that people call instrumental motivation. Now, Gardner's work was much more complex than this, and didn't just boil down to a simple integrated versus instrumental motivation. But this is something that had really caught people's attention as a way of conceptualizing motivation. And so I'll talk about instrumental and integrated motivation, but I didn't want to sort of sell Gardner's work short and say that's the whole picture. It was actually a lot more well developed than that. But the idea of integrative orientation or motivation, we say orientation sometimes because sometimes people say, well, the motivation is just the effort and the desire that comes at the end. But what's behind that is different, and that's what we call the orientation. So if it talks about an integrative orientation, which leads to their motivation, this is when the learner's goals come from a liking of the target language group and a desire to meet and interact with members of this group. So people who say, I want to go to that country or that part of the world, and I want to learn more about culture, I want to get to know people. If that's what's driving their language learning, then that's what we might call an integrative motivation. Instrumental motivation, on the other hand, occurs when a learner has some functional goals that are associated with the language learning. Okay? So it might be that they need to learn this language in order to get into university, for example. Or it might mean that they need to learn the language to get a particular job that they really want. And so they'll learn the language in order to pass the exam or whatever it is that helps them to achieve that goal. And that's what we call instrumental orientation or motivation. So the initial research that was done supported a view that integrated motivation was superior in terms of its success on foreign or second language learning. And you can imagine that seems logical in a way, because if someone is integratively motivated, if their attitudes towards the target language group are such that they're interested in them, they want to get to know them better, they want to get closer to them, then that's something that is quite enduring. And so it's a kind of a motivation that seems somehow deeper and more lasting. Whereas an instrumental kind of motivation, when the goal or the purpose is reached, then it seems logical the motivation would drop off after that, because okay, I got into university, so I don't need to study that language anymore, or whatever the instrumental reason was. However, when the study started being done outside Canada, where this research originally started, they found that, in fact, instrumental motivation was in some cases very, very powerful. And I imagine you've probably seen situations in Korea where someone has not necessarily a sort of integrative orientation in their language learning, but a very strong instrumental goal. And they go for it, and they do really well. It's really strong. So instrumental motivation isn't necessarily inferior. The problem is sometimes that it's unless it becomes internalized in some way, it may kind of drop off once the endpoint has been reached. So that was the beginning of motivation research. But then in the 1990s, beginning of the 1990s, people started saying, why don't we try and expand the research agenda and look at motivation in a broader way? And particularly, people started getting interested in what motivates learners in classrooms, in classroom situations, and what we call the situation-specific factors. So what is it specifically about learning situations that motivate or demotivate learners? And then we also had ideas from cognitive psychology. I'll show you some examples of that in a moment, that came into the models of language learning motivation. So original model of Gardner and his colleagues was much more about attitudes to the other ethno-linguistic community. It wasn't necessarily too much about the kind of theoretical views of motivation that you might see in other areas of psychology, for example. So that started coming into the picture as well. And then people also started realizing that motivation is not something that stays the same every day. So when you wake up in the morning, you don't necessarily feel equally motivated every day to study whatever foreign language or second language you're studying. Some days you feel really motivated, other days you think, oh, yeah, 힘들어. People started thinking we have to build that into the model as well. So this is there were lots of frameworks of motivation developed in the 1990s, and here's one. This is just one, but I think it's one that I really like, and it was developed by Zoltán Dorje in 1994. Anyone ever heard of Zoltán Dorje before? Read his work? If you read research on language learning motivation, you'll start to come across his name a lot. He's probably the most prolific writer in the field of second language learning motivation at the moment. So this was one of his early works, and he's still writing lots of interesting things. He's from Hungary originally, but works in the UK. So what he has in his tripartite framework, this is sort of like a three-level framework. At the language level, we have the integrated motivational subsystem and the instrumental motivational subsystem. So what he's done here is taken the ideas of integrated and instrumental motivation and built them into the model, but put them at a specific level called the language level. And so rather than stopping there, he's gone on to talk about the learner level and the learning situation level as well. So at the learner level, we have things like the need for achievement. So people, kind of a basic human need to feel like you've achieved something. And if you make tangible gains in language learning, that's certainly something that gives you a feeling of achievement. If you spend months and months studying a language and don't feel you've achieved anything, then that need for achievement is not met. And so that can be quite demotivating. He's also got self-confidence there, and a few elements under that, such as language use anxiety. Now, some people would say language anxiety is separate. That's different from motivation. That's a whole different area of individual difference. But of course, anxiety and motivation will interact, so it's there. Perceived second language self-confidence, causal attributions, and self-efficacy. So when we have causal attributions, what that means is that when we succeed at something or when we fail at something, could be a test or just anything. It could even be like going to a language class and feeling, oh, I couldn't answer the teacher's question and I really should have been able to do that, or something like that. So a feeling of that didn't go very well. In our brain, we attribute that success or failure to different things. And that might be, whether we attribute it accurately or not, doesn't matter really so much. It's more like the way we think about it that affects the motivation. So if I give you an example, if someone says, I'm learning Arabic at the moment, but Arabic is just too hard, so that's why I haven't made any progress. That's a kind of that's attributing the lack of progress to the language. Blame the language. The language is too hard. Okay? And so that kind of thinking is generally associated with sort of negative motivational thinking, because if you think about it, you can't change whether the language is hard or not. Okay? If you say it's too hard, that's why I can't do it, then it's beyond your control. However, if someone said, oh, I did poorly on my Chinese exam because I didn't put enough work into studying for it, that still sounds a little bit like failure, but it's actually a more positive motivational, positive attributional way of thinking, because you're attributing it to the amount of work that you put in, and that is something that you can control. So you say, well, I didn't do very well, but that's my fault. I didn't work hard enough, so I need to work harder. It's within your control. So the causal attributions there are really quite important for motivation. And you probably see this among your own students sometimes, that if they if they get a test or a quiz or an exam back and they've not done well or they've done more poorly than they expected, then they of course look disappointed, but probably they're thinking, why? Okay? And so it's quite important there that that students don't start to feel like they haven't done well because for reasons that are completely beyond their control. Because if they believe that, then they will think, I have no control over this. And that relates to the next one, which is self-efficacy. So the feeling of how effective people feel they are in changing something or taking particular action to achieve a particular goal. And of course, some students maybe find language study very hard, and it's not something that maybe they're very good at mathematics, they're not very good at language learning or something like that. But if they believe that that's why they're not succeeding, and they think that's the whole story, then it's not going to do good things for their motivation. Finally, the learning situation, which relates to the course that people are doing, teacher-specific motivational components and group-specific motivational components. And I couldn't fit those all on the slide, so I put those on the next slide here. This is the expanded learning situation level there. So when it comes to the language course, there are a few elements here. There's interest, relevance, expectancy, and satisfaction. And of course, when students are studying language at a school, the curriculum is generally fixed and set for them. So they can't sort of go along and say, well, I don't want to do what you're teaching today, or I don't want to do what's in the textbook, I want to do something else. But unfortunately, if that's the course they're doing, at least as far as the course is concerned, it's fixed. But in other cases, people have a choice about, certainly adult learners, they often have a choice about the kind of class that they go to. And I've felt this myself actually, because a number of years ago I was studying Japanese as a hobby. And I learned Japanese for quite a number of years. And then I married someone from Korea, and I thought, okay, maybe I need to change my language now. But when I was going to a Japanese language course, I know sometimes I tried one particular course, and I think it was some other students of the course, they quite liked it, and it was fine for them. But when I looked at the question of expectancy, what did I expect to get out of the course? Or what did I expect the way the things we would do? I felt, no, it was mismatched. It wasn't matched with what I expected. Because I expected we would speak in Japanese, but the teacher explained everything in English. And the teacher was a native Japanese speaker. And the students asked lots of questions in English. And they got the answers in English. And sometimes they were happy because they were curious about the meaning of this word or the meaning of this expression, so the teacher would give them a very nice explanation in English and they were happy. But I wasn't particularly happy because I thought, oh, at the end of the course, my Japanese hasn't really changed. It's I wanted to do lots of speaking practice. So then I went to a different course, and that course did exactly what I liked. So I thought, oh, this is good, and I stayed with that course for a very long time. And it was, but it was not about this. It was not that one was a bad one and one was a good one. It was just matched my interest. It was relevant to what I wanted to learn, and I felt satisfied with it. It sort of matched my expectations. But for other people, it may not have. Okay, other people may have gone to that course and said, "The teacher speaks Japanese all the time. She doesn't want to explain this in English to me. I don't understand. I don't like that." So they would go back to the first course that I didn't like. So these kind of course-specific components are really important. Then we come to the teacher, and you have things to do with the teacher that influence motivation as well. So you have affiliative drive. So how well learners relate to the teacher. Okay, how do they see the teacher? Do they see the teacher as a role model? So in some cases, for example, if you're a native Korean speaker and you're teaching English, and the students know that they can see you can speak English really well, and they think, okay, that teacher has the same first language background as me. They've learned the language I'm trying to learn. They've done it, I can do it. Okay, so that sometimes there's this kind of ability to relate to the teacher. In other cases, people don't relate to their teacher very well. And that might not be just because they come from a different language background, but for various reasons they might not relate to the teacher. But sometimes teachers can be really motivating just because people like the teacher, they relate well to the teacher, they see the teacher as a role model. Then we have the authority type in the classroom. So does the teacher run a kind of a democratic classroom or more of a top-down hierarchical sort of classroom? And then we have the direct socialization of motivation, things like modeling. So how does the teacher present a model of the language and sometimes a role model as a language learner? How do they present tasks and how do they offer feedback? Okay, so to use a very strong example, if a teacher offers very critical feedback on spoken performance in front of other students, then students may kind of feel like, oh, I don't want to say anything now because I'm going to get ridiculed in front of the class. So that can have a really strong effect on motivation. Whereas if feedback's offered in a different way, then it can assist motivation. Finally, you have the group-specific motivational components, and this relates to how the class or the group of learners functions as a group. Okay, do they have sort of a sense of a common purpose? What's the norms in the class? So when I was studying Japanese, for example, in the class which was run using a modified version of the direct method, so the teacher used only Japanese in the class. We also knew that was the norm for the class, and everybody was sort of thought, yeah, we'll play along with this norm. Okay, we'll try not to ask questions in English. We'll try to ask our questions in Japanese, and if we don't understand, we'll try to ask again rather than expecting an English explanation, because that's not the class norm. But if we hadn't done that, if we'd been resisting those class norms, then the whole situation would have become much more demotivating, I think. So things to do with the classroom, the goals that the class has, and how well it sticks together, I think, are really important. So this is these are the kind of things I was talking about with causal attributions. Welcome to those of you who just joined us. We're just talking about some of the looking at the motivation model, and just talking about some of the things that motivate language learners, demotivate. So if a learner says, I did poorly on my French exam because I'm no good at language learning, would you say that's a positive sort of attributional pattern or a negative one? Negative, yeah. It's negative because I'm no good at language learning. I can't do anything about it, so it's beyond my control. So it's not going to help them feel more motivated. I'm progressing well with my Japanese learning because I attend the class regularly, enjoy it. That's pretty obvious. That's a positive one. I did poorly on my Chinese exam because I didn't put enough work into preparing for it. As I said before, that's also a positive kind of motivational way of thinking, because putting enough work into it is something that you have control over. So say next time I'll do it differently. And the last one, which is already one I already said, Arabic is just too hard. This is why I haven't made any progress. Again, that's a negative one because people can't do anything about whether a language is hard or not. So that was the 1990s, and I think a lot of those ideas are still relevant today. But things move on, and we keep sort of thinking about motivation in new ways. But I don't think it means you need to throw out the old ways. It just means that you can add new ways to thinking about motivation and new ways of perhaps helping your students become motivated if they're not already. Since 2000, there's been an increased recognition that motivation is dynamic and varies over time, which we already knew, but that's been more the focus of the models that have come up since then. And also, a way of looking at motivation that focuses on the learner's self-concept, their idea of who they are, and how learning a second or foreign language or an additional language, how does that fit into who they are now and who they are in the future? So in the late 90s, we had the process model of motivation here, which Roger and Otto developed. And that was a kind of a cyclical, a sort of cycle view of motivation, where we had a pre-actional stage, which is where learners planned, they set their goals and they planned what they were going to do. Then an action stage, which involved actually studying the language, doing things to learn. And then a post-actional stage where they looked back on what they'd been doing and reflected on it to see how effective it was or wasn't, and then made some adjustments before planning the next phase. So that was the process model of motivation. But the one that I want to talk about is the L2 motivational self-system. And this is because if you look at motivation research that's published in academic journals these days, you'll find that many, if not most of the studies use this L2 motivational self-system as the basis for their for the research that's being done. And the L2 motivational self-system came about because Zoltan Dornier, who I mentioned before, is this very prolific motivation researcher. He was thinking a lot about the concept of integratedness, sort of the idea of being driven to learn a language because you're interested in the people who speak that language, and you want to get closer to them, and you want to know them, and you want to interact with them. He thought that integrativeness, the idea works quite well in some contexts. So for example, in the Canadian context, where you had French Canadians and English Canadians and learning each other's languages, that worked quite well. But when you have people, say, learning English around the world, you think, integratedness. So if you've got an integrated motivation to learn English, English is kind of this global language that's it's a native language for some groups of people, and it's used as a kind of common language in other situations. So it didn't explain a lot of the motivation that might be happening, particularly for languages like that, where you didn't have one particular target group of speakers that you could imagine, but it was a more kind of globally diffuse kind of group of speakers that you might want to interact with. And with learning English, for example, people might say, well, I'm not learning English just to talk to native speakers of English. I want to talk to all kinds of people. And many of them won't be using English as their first language. They'll be using it as an additional language. And so they'll be using it as a common language. So when we think about integratedness, you can think about the learning context. And does that make a difference to how we think about integratedness? So if someone's learning Spanish in the United States, for example, versus learning Spanish in Korea, you can see that it's a little bit different. So I guess if you're learning Spanish in the USA, in many parts of the USA, there are huge numbers of Spanish speakers. So learning Spanish in the USA, say, well, Spanish is, I don't have to go very far to find Spanish. You know, to find Spanish, lots of Spanish speakers, lots of families with who've got the Spanish language and the cultural associations there. So it's very much immediate. Whereas if you're learning Spanish in Korea, you say, well, you don't just walk outside and find lots of Spanish speakers walking around everywhere. I don't think you do anyway. So it's a little bit different. It's the same language, but different kind of learning context. And then we have the target language as well. So some languages are very much associated with particular groups of speakers, associated with one country or even one area of a country. And others are not associated with any country at all. So, for example, if you are motivated to learn Latin, we're going to speak Latin. Maybe some Latin scholars somewhere, I don't know. But it's not something you'd be learning probably for spoken communication. Whereas if you're learning a language like English, then it's very diverse, and different people may want to integrate different groups. So in the L2 motivational self-system, what Roger의 did is he kind of tried to turn that around the other way and say, instead of looking at integrating with something outside, well, let's look at integrativeness from a self perspective. So the kind of ideal person that somebody wants to be, and how does learning a second language fit into that? So the L2 motivational self-system has three components: the ideal L2 self, the ought-to L2 self, and the L2 learning experience. And so the ideal L2 self is the second language element of the person that you want to be in the future, the kind of attributes that you would like to have, and whether that includes being able to speak and use another language. The ought-to L2 self is similar, but it's not so much the feeling that a person wants to have, but the feeling of what's expected of them. Okay? Now, sometimes what's expected of them might be what they expect of themselves. Okay? So sometimes, interestingly, some people are really, they feel like, I really want to be a second language. I really want to be able to speak that language well. It's really important to me. Other people say, it's not so much that it's important to me, but I'll feel very disappointed in myself if I don't do it. I think I expect myself to do it. And then other people say, other people expect me to do it. I'm expected to do this by my family or by society or whatever. So that's what the ought-to L2 self is. But sometimes an ought-to feeling from yourself and sometimes from outside. And then the second language learning experience relates to the individual's immediate language learning context and the kind of experiences that they have, the obstacles that they confront. So there's a little kind of picture of the ideal L2 self. So it's the person thinking about the gap between where they are now and where they want to be in the future. So it's a kind of gap that drives the language, the motivation. That's the idea here. Okay? And this is me, by the way. I didn't mean it to be me, but I thought it sort of looks a bit like me. So that's what it is. So you can imagine someone looking into the future, thinking that's the future second language me, and that's where I want to get to. And the idea here is that language learning is something that doesn't happen over a week or a month or something, but it happens over a very long period of time. So somehow motivation has to be based in something quite sustaining. Otherwise, as soon as people encounter obstacles, they're going to quit or they're going to give up. But if they sort of say, no, this is where I want to get to, this is one way of thinking about motivation. So that's just another way of seeing it. You've got current L2 self and the future L2 self, and there has to be something to keep this future vision alive. So if it's not a very strong vision in the first place, it's likely to kind of people are likely to lose interest in it. But it has to be kind of constantly reinvigorated, if you like. And this is where the learning experience can come into play. So people feel that they're making progress, for example, towards their future image, then that can be very motivating. But the other thing is that the important thing for learners then is to be able to self-regulate their learning to overcome obstacles, because language learning is not always going to be smooth, and people are going to run into problems and things like that. And they need to know how to manage those kind of problems themselves, so that they don't end up giving up the language learning altogether. I've been involved with a little bit of research looking at whether how this actually works in practice, this language learning future self, because it's kind of an abstract concept. Learners don't walk around usually saying, "Oh, my future L2 self is to be able to speak 3 languages really fluent." They don't kind of talk about it like that. So talking to some language learners, I found it a little bit hard to find any evidence of a kind of a vision that is driving them, even when they've achieved a lot. However, in one situation where a PhD student of mine was doing some research looking at university students in Japan, and they were going on a short-term study abroad stay to Australia. I think it was just 2 weeks or 4 weeks, very short term. Anyway, what he did with these students is that before they went to Australia, he introduced them to the idea of a future self-image, about the self-image with regard to English, and he asked them to sort of imagine what you'll be like in the future, how does English fit into your future, that kind of thing. And then the next week, they were on a plane going to Australia, staying with an Australian family, going to university there, just for a very short time. And then they came back, and so he interviewed them again to ask them about their future image and their motivation. And in that situation, we found that this imagining future self really seemed to work well. Now, the reason I think it worked well was because, in a sense, these students were trying out. They were learning or thinking about future second language self, and then immediately they were going to a very different environment and experimenting with it. So it was kind of like, here, we'll give you a chance to experience your future self, see what it's like. Okay? And some of them went there and they went to Australia and they thought, "Ooh, this is really hard. This is really difficult. Gee, I'm afraid I'm going to fail if I don't put a lot of work into this language learning." Others had experience. They said, "That was really great. I could talk much more than I thought, and I could talk about interesting topics, and I could talk to new people, and it was really exciting. Wow, I want to study more." So we found that in that particular situation, it was actually possible to harness the power of this future self vision. So it makes me think that, I think certainly for study abroad opportunities and things like that, where people are actually in the situation where they're going to be able to experience this, it might be something that could work quite well. So there's a reference to that paper. Mitchell Fryer was this PhD student of mine, so it's Fryer and Roger. But you'll see it at the end there if you want to have a look at that paper. You don't have to, but if you're interested, that was the one. So we talked about the ideal second language self, but what I would like to propose is that, as I said at the beginning, we kind of broaden out the idea of a second language self to a multilingual self, okay? To a self that speaks more than one language. And because I think the problem with, I think the idea of the second language self is really fascinating, but I'm not the only one to say this. I wish I had thought of the idea first, but I didn't. But I think broadening it out to a multilingual self helps people to value what they already have and see themselves as someone who is already linguistically complete. They already speak at least one first language, very, 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 very well. And what they're doing is adding to their linguistic repertoire. So rather than focusing on ourselves as deficient speakers of a second language, it's good to sort of remember, okay, we already have something. Sometimes being in Korea, I get really frustrated with myself as a very deficient Korean speaker, extremely deficient Korean speaker. I think I should be much better. There's no excuse. But if I go into that kind of negative way of thinking, then I think it's perhaps not helpful. So if I remember what I already can do, even if it's nothing wonderful too much, but I can think, okay, this is what I already can do. But I want to develop that further. I want to build on that by deepening and broadening my knowledge of Korean in particular. Then that's a particular direction to go. So last week I was in Everland. So this week I'm working. And last week I was on holiday. Last week I was in Everland with my wife and 2 kids and brother-in-law. And usually, if I'm walking around with our children, people don't usually come up and talk to me. But I was by myself for a few minutes, and so these high school kids came to me. So you know the story, I'm sure. Yes. So I said, "Oh, hello. Where are you from?" Yeah. And it's very interesting. So they came up. They're Korean high school students or middle school students, maybe. They came up to me. They didn't have to talk to me, but they did. They were speaking to me in English, which was correct. They made the correct guess. So yeah, it looks like he speaks English. I do. But I responded. I said, "호주사입니다." I thought, why did I do that? Because they came to me in English, and so it got me thinking, why did I have to respond? So then after that, they said, "Oh, Australia," and I said, "Yes, that's right." So I did say some things in English, but at first I didn't want to say anything in English, and I thought, why didn't I want to respond just in English? Because obviously they're showing me they can speak English and I speak English. Why don't I just do it? And I think it was a kind of feeling inside me to say that I don't only speak English, I can speak a bit of Korean. And then I thought, I don't know what they were thinking about themselves, but I'm guessing perhaps they were thinking they didn't have to talk to me. They were being friendly, and they were showing, in a sense, they were showing, oh, okay, I know this, I know English. Here, I can use it, and it can work. Okay, so they were sort of demonstrating bilingualism, and I think I wanted to do the same in a sense. But so we could have gone on with them speaking English and me speaking Korean. And then probably their English would be better than my Korean, so they would win the game. But it was just a very short encounter. But it makes me think that being bilingual is actually something that even where people might feel like they don't have a strong integrated motive to learn a language, or they might feel like, okay, I just learned this language for exams and then that's finished. But if they know a little bit about being bilingual and the concept of that, I think that can be an additional motivator. So, back in 1989, a neurolinguist by the name of François Grosjean wrote a paper in the journal Brain and Language called Neurolinguists Beware. The bilingual is not two monolinguals in one person. Okay, so he's a bilingualism researcher, but he at that stage anyway, wasn't a social researcher of bilingualism, but a cognitive neurolinguistic researcher. And I think this statement was probably obvious even in 1989, at the time that bilingualism doesn't mean you have two language balloons in your head. You have one language here and one language there, and they don't interact. However, what he was saying is that the way that people did experiments in neurolinguistics often were kind of designed in a way that you sort of try to isolate this language and that language and pretend that they worked in isolation where they really didn't. There's lots of text here, so don't worry about trying to read it all now. But François Grosjean himself grew up with a mixture of English and French heritage, and talks about his own experiences sort of moving from one place to another and adjusting to a new language and cultural environment. But in 2010, he wrote a book about a book that was designed to appeal to not only to researchers but to anyone who's interested in bilingualism. And he argued that a lot of people who speak more than one language tend to they tend not to value what they have, in a sense. So if you ask people who are using 2 languages in their life, are you bilingual? Oh, no, I'm not bilingual. Because I think bilingual means they can use 2 languages in exactly the same way, in a perfect way. And they can do anything in either of the 2 languages. But he said that's actually very rare. Most people have what's called complementary bilingualism. So they can do certain things in one language, they do other things in another language, and sometimes multilingualism, they might do different things in different languages. But they can't necessarily, they don't necessarily do everything in each of their languages. But they are confident that different types of users of language. So he's arguing, well, bilingualism is actually more than half of the world are bilingual, and this is the norm. And we should value what we have and not sort of feel that bilinguals should behave like 2 monolinguals in one person, which everybody kind of knows, but people still have this view that it should happen. So when we come to back to the motivation research, we see in 2017, Alistair Henry, who's a motivation researcher, making almost the same point as Roger made. He says, by tradition, second language motivation research has had a monolingual bias. The motivational systems of the learners' different languages conceptualized as separate entities rather than as cognitively interconnected. And he goes on to propose what he calls the multilingual motivational self-system. And Emma Bushiota, who's another researcher in the area of motivation, makes some similar points in her article. These are both articles from the Modern Language Journal in 2017. And she says that we could think about multilingual selves instead of ideal second language selves. So it's really the same kind of concept, but just expanding it to think of ourselves as multilingual instead of taking one language and separating it from the others. So I basically think that it's useful for language learners to see the language learning process as a path to bilingualism, in a sense. So, right from the start, as soon as language learner can do anything in the language, they are on the path to becoming bilingual. I think, so what I would say is that in language classes, talking a bit about bilingualism is something that we can usefully do. And I've got a link here on this slide. I'll see if we can, if you'd like these slides in electronic form, and you can click on the link. It's much easier than trying to type it in somewhere. But Roger here is he's got a list of what he calls some myths about bilingualism, which I can share with you. And I think something like this, adapted for language learners, would be really useful. So he's got things like bilingualism is a rare phenomenon. Wrong. Okay. Bilinguals acquire their 2 languages in childhood. Wrong. Okay, so all these things that people think you have to meet to be bilingual, he's arguing that you in fact don't have to, so in a sense anyone can tell you this, I guess, but if it comes from a major bilingualism researcher who spent his life thinking and writing about these sorts of things, people say, oh, okay. He said I can be bilingual, so all right, I can. So there's a good list of myths there. I won't go through them all now, but you can have a look at them if you like. And I think it would be useful to use them with language learners, even if you, in whatever form, just to get them to value what they already have. from a human perspective, I think it's really important to start off with second language learning with valuing first language. So our first language is a central part of our, I guess, autobiographical narrative. It's like part of our story. One colleague of mine said a student once that when he was teaching English came up to him at the end of the class and said, "I want to speak just like you." And he said, "Well, if you want to speak like me, then you have to have my life. You want my life." And so he was saying that we all have our own life, and so we shouldn't sort of have a feeling that we have to speak like other people. Okay? So our first language connects us to our family and friends. It allows us to express and understand very complex ideas and feelings, and to appreciate humor and subtlety and all these kinds of things. And if you're lucky enough to be able to do these things in a second language, that's wonderful. But if not, then people have their first language, which they can do these things. From a cognitive perspective, when we learn a new language, it's not like it's going into a separate little thing in our brain. It's going in. Some parts of that learning may be separate. Okay, particularly things where you learn the grammar of a language in a formally taught way, that may be stored separately. But a lot of the language is going into the same part of the brain as your first language. And we know that when people are speaking or listening or using language, the other languages that they speak are not asleep or completely off in the corner, but they're also being activated as well. And what bilinguals do, what all of you do, is when you're speaking in English, for example. I'm assuming your first language is Korean. Korean is also being activated, but you can, if you're speaking to me, for example, you would carry on a conversation, and even though the Korean is being activated as well, your brain is inhibiting it so that you can have a continuous train in one language. Okay? Now, if you're speaking with another Korean-English bilingual person, you can switch back and forth, and that works quite well. But as soon as you speak to someone who only speaks one of your languages, you're successfully able to inhibit that other one. And you might think that's a lot of work for a brain to do, but it's actually something that comes in very handy, because bilingual people are very good at this switching attention and selecting and inhibiting. And so it's one of the cognitive skills that's associated with bilingualism. So in the until about the 1950s or 1960s, people thought that bilingualism was a disadvantage for children. They thought, if you're learning two languages, you're going to be not going to be as smart, you're not going to do as well on cognitive tasks and things like that. But this was because the way that they tested those children in this case was basically they tested in a monolingual way. But when they actually looked at the way that they were testing those children, they found out that bilingualism actually is associated with a number of cognitive advantages. And even if people haven't learned two languages from a very, very young age, learning a second language, basically to a higher level, the better, and the more use, the better. But these kinds of cognitive advantages, I think, can come with language learning at any age. And if you say, well, how much do you have to know? Basically, the more the better. I think that seems to be the best answer that I can find looking at the literature. So we have superior executive control, so paying selective attention to things and switching attention when needed. And this is thought to be because the bilingual brain is very practiced at doing this, because it is used to selecting a particular language at a particular time. And so it gets very good at doing this, and can do it with a lot less effort than someone who only speaks one language. Other things that you see particularly in children is superior understandings of the distinctions between form and meaning in solving verbal problems. So, for example, Ellen Bialystok, who is a bilingualism researcher in Canada. She uses an example that she talks about with bilingual children. Testing bilingual children and monolingual children. And she asks them the question about, she says, tell me, can you say this? Is this grammatically correct? Is it okay to say this? It might be nonsense, but is it okay to say it? Is it said correctly? It says, apples grow on noses. Apples grow on noses. So what she finds is that a lot of monolingual children say, no, you can't say that. Okay? And the way she puts it in an interview I heard with her was that she says, you can't say it because you can't mean it. Okay? The meaning is nonsense, so therefore you can't say that. Whereas bilingual children say, apples grow on noses. Yeah, that's silly, but yes, it's correct. It is actually correct. So they can make this distinction between form and meaning, which monolingual children, I mean, it's on average, some monolingual children probably can do this, but bilingual children tend to be better at it because they realize, because of having more than one language, they implicitly realize that form and meaning are not inextricably tied together. The third area that might not be very motivating for the kind of learners that you teach or at school, because they're probably not thinking about becoming elderly and whether they'll develop dementia or something like that. That sort of seems like hundreds of years away. But certainly for older people, there's some emerging evidence that bilingual people tend to manifest conditions like Alzheimer's disease later on in life. And it's not that the bilingualism protects them against Alzheimer's disease. It's that it gives them more reserve, so that the disease has to progress further before the symptoms become noticeable. And so this is something, I think there's still room for a lot more research there, but it's a sort of emerging pattern that it helps to sort of what we call cognitive reserve, gives you a bit more of an extra safety room, I guess, in the brain. So again, I think with these kinds of things, it's interesting to think about them and to realize that if people want to learn a language and make it something that they do seriously, they do every day, they work on, they try and use it, it's probably going to help their brain. So some people talk about it as an analogous thing to exercising for sort of physical fitness, sort of brain fitness. So for some learners, they don't need to know this; they're already motivated. But for others, who sort of say, well, I don't really, they find it hard to see a reason to learn another language. The idea of being bilingual may be appealing. This is just a little fun activity. It's called the Stroop test. Has anyone seen this before? You probably have. Some people. This is it's about where I was mentioning executive control. So where you have two different stimuli coming in at once, and you have to selectively pay attention to one thing. This is something that bilingual people have been found to be better at doing. And so in this case, how it works here. In this case, you'll see words printed up with the names of colors, okay? And sometimes you see R-E-D, and the color of the word is red, and the word says red, okay? So if you're asked to sort of say, okay, what color is the word? Then red, it's easy, okay? However, if you're asked to say, okay, what color is the word? And the color of the word is red, but the word says G-R-E-E-N, then it's actually you have to sort of stop yourself seeing green and pressing the button for green, but think, okay, no, I'm looking at the color of the word, not what the word says, okay? So if you, I'll just show you a little bit how this works. So what I have to do here, I tried this myself and I was not very good at it, so I better work more on language learning, I think. So what you have to do here is press R for red, Y for yellow, G for green, B for blue on the keyboard. Okay. So you can call out the answers to me if you like, but I'll just show you how this works. So if I'm too slow, then it doesn't work. Oops! Oh, I pressed green. See? Okay. Oops! Too slow. So you get the idea there. I want you can play with that if you've got nothing better to do on a Saturday sometime. But gives you a little bit of an idea of what we mean by executive control, and so you have to pay attention to one stimulus and ignore the other. And this is why bilingual people are better at this, because their brains are used to doing that. The last thing that I would like to suggest that might be useful for language learners is the idea of a language passport. Has anyone heard of a language passport? This is, again, I wish I'd invented this idea, but I haven't. It's from the Council of Europe, so it's a European idea, and it's like a person. You have a CV which you use to apply for jobs. A language passport is kind of like it's like a language CV, if you like, but it's a kind of a document that you can use to apply for jobs, and it lists the languages that you speak and your self-rated proficiency in those languages. So it's I think one of the problems for language learners sometimes is that they can't see what they have, and language learning looks so unfocused that it's hard for them to sort of see any progress. And I think that creating a language passport online, whether you use this kind of template, or whether you would create your own, I think could be really useful for learners. And I'm not suggesting they should go and use their passport to try and get a job, but they could use it just for themselves, and they can update it themselves. So if you click on this little link here, I'll show you. So you go to here, create your own language passport online. I'll get these links to you so you can try this for yourself. Here what you do is you type in your name. And oops, sorry. There we are. I'm just going to do it so you can see, just to but even though it's a European thing, you can actually find Korean there, so your language learners can find their mother tongue. Okay, and if I were to French is probably about my best second language, even though it's not very good. But there we see it's created that there. And what I do for any of my second languages here is I can click on self-assessment. Okay, so what this does is it takes you to a link to what's called the Common European Framework of Language Proficiency. So it's got these I can statements. So you can see the most basic. I can understand familiar words and very basic phrases concerning myself, my family, immediate concrete surroundings when people speak slowly and clearly. So for a lot of your learners, at the beginning stages, they might say, okay, well, I can do that. Okay. And for each of the different things, for reading it does the same. Okay, and spoken interaction, spoken production, and writing. So they can enter their level there for each of these things. And what I like about it is it's got these I can statements. So it's not like I can't do this and I can't do that. It's like the things they can do. And so you can create it online and you can save it and you can go back and edit it online if you want to. But I think it's just having something like this I think would help for learners to sort of see, okay, this is my language self. Okay, this is my bilingual or my multilingual self. And I've actually noticed when I've had some European students in my classes in Australia, that the way they talk about language learning is a little bit different from, say, the Australian students or other international students. But they talk a lot about, they know what level they are with different languages. And they know how many hours approximately it takes to get to the next level. This kind of thing, which I think is really useful for learners to kind of take responsibility for, in a sense. Sort of walk around saying, I know my levels. And from time to time, hopefully their levels can go up from various times. So I think the idea of a language passport, even if it's just a document that they keep privately themselves, they don't need to show it to anyone else, but it just sort of says, okay, here's me, here's my mother tongue, here's all of my second languages, foreign languages, and the ones that they're working on at the moment, hopefully the level can go up from time to time. But just having that, I think, is useful. So, just in conclusion, what I'd like to say is we should value all our languages, particularly our first language or mother tongue, and remember always that we're linguistically complete individuals, whatever languages we speak. This sounds obvious, but I think sometimes in the context of language learning, particularly when people go overseas and their first language is not the language that everyone's speaking, they tend to sort of forget that they've already got this first language. And I think we should take a really broad view of being multilingual or bilingual. Say, okay, as soon as we can do anything in second language, okay, even go up to someone and say, hello, where are you from? Okay, we're multilingual. And we're on the journey to being multilingual, and we can start to sort of broaden and deepen from there. And in addition to the communicative possibilities that new languages open up, there's also the kind of benefits to the brain. So if people can't imagine immediately I don't need this language to communicate at the moment, they can still realize, well, it's good for my brain anyway. And then finally, I think that using native speakers of a language as a standard is really useful. So when I'm learning Korean, I always want to know how native Korean speakers say this, or what word they'd use here, what expression they would use here. But I don't expect that I'm going to use Korean like a native speaker of Korean because I'm not one. But that's okay. I still find the standard really useful, but I don't have to feel like that's going to be me, because we're all unique in terms of the different languages we have and how we want to use them and how we need to use them. And so I think that's an important thing for others to keep in mind. Sorry, I didn't give you any time for questions or anything like that, but we probably have time for a few questions until they tell me to get off and move away. Any questions you'd like to ask or any comments? Yes.
Yeah. It is nice to hear that bilingual people have less chance to get Alzheimer's.
Yes.
Then my question is that to see how neurolinguists have progressed in their research and studies, is there a specific journal they post their paper, like in TESOL journal?
Yes, there's a particular paper. Actually, I realized I don't think I put it on the end of my slide. So I should. It's by. There's a particular paper by Bialystok, Craig, and Luck. I think it's. I think what the journal is. Whether it's. I'll have to check the name of the journal. And there's also another paper by a researcher named by the name of Bach, B-A-K, Thomas Bach, B-A-K. Recently, and I don't remember the name of the journal, but there's a couple of references. Can I send them? I might send them to Alicia Kwan, and maybe she can send them out. I don't know if she's got all your email. She got all your email addresses. Yeah. Anyway, I'll see if I can get it distributed because you might be interested to read that. It's quite early research at the moment. It doesn't seem that there's less chance of getting Alzheimer's, but it seems that there's more years before the Alzheimer's becomes a problem for people. That's what it's showing so far. Any other? If not, thank you all very much. It's been wonderful to